Welcome, students, to the first part of the reproductive system. So you'll see this chapter is split into really 4 parts, looking at both kind of male reproductive anatomy and physiology, female reproductive anatomy and physiology. We're going to actually talk about the anatomy of both sexes first, and then spend some time walking through the physiology of both of these two systems. But before we even get into kind of male versus female, there are some shared characteristics that both systems kind of have and kind of do for us, starting, of course, with why do we have a reproductive system? It's kind of inherent in the name, right? Reproduction. One of the things that's unique about the reproductive system is that unlike all of your other systems, your nervous system and your muscle system and your skeletal system and your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system and your endocrine system, all those other body systems that are with you from the time you are, born, basically, and even some of them a little bit before that. The reproductive system isn't like that. The reproductive system doesn't actually really kick in until puberty and afterwards. So most children really don't have a very well-functioning reproductive system. It's really not until, you can't reproduce until you've gone through puberty, until you've kind of activated these reproductive organs. So when we're talking about reproduction, we're really talking about kind of 4 things, right? We're talking about we need these reproductive organs to make our gametes, our sex cells, that we then combined in the form of sexual intercourse, right? So the sex cells for males, sperm; sex cells for females, ova, eggs, basically. And so we get that's kind of one job of the reproductive systems in both males and females. And then once we have our sex eggs, our sex cells, our eggs and our sperm, we combine them, right? The sperm fertilizes the egg. That process is sexual intercourse or copulation, and there are reproductive organs that help us do that as well. And then most of the rest of this takes place in the female body. So we get the formation of a zygote when the sperm fertilizes the egg. That's fertilization. We combine the genetic material there. And then the kind of subsequent development of the fetus and subsequent birth of the baby, again, all coming from the female reproductive system. And so the female reproductive system is slightly more complicated than the male reproductive system, in part because of pregnancy and childbirth, gestation and parturition. And so we will spend probably more time talking about kind of female physiology than male physiology, just because there are a little bit more complicating factors with female physiology. So as I mentioned, in addition to the kind of 4 things that they help us do, there are things that the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system have in common, even though they are quite different. For one, they are made up of what we call homologous structures, meaning during the development of the embryo, what starts off and what eventually becomes, say, for instance, the testes in males, is the same tissue that will become the ovaries in females. They have, they have different anatomies, but they have the same purpose in that, in the case of the testes and the ovaries, the production of the sex cells. Another good example of a homologous structure is the male penis and the female clitoris. Again, same developmental kind of origin, but they also serve a similar function in terms of arousal during copulation. So that's kind of a unique thing in terms of looking at both reproductive systems. As I mentioned, they do have very similar primary sex organs, what we call gonads, testes in males, ovaries in females, of course. The way they produce their gametes is via meiosis, which is a slightly different process than mitosis, and we'll talk more about that. And then in addition to creating these gametes, these sex cells, the testes and the ovaries produce sex hormones. These sex hormones are steroidal sex hormones. Cholesterol is actually the basis for a good chunk of them. So males, we're talking about androgens, things like testosterone, and in females, we're talking about estrogen and progesterone, typically. And then in addition to kind of very similar primary sex organs, there are also a similar kind of what we call accessory organs. There's a whole series of ducts and glands, and some shared features amongst the external genitalia. The other thing that all of the reproductive systems, males and females, have in common is that they are regulated and controlled hormonally, particularly through something called the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis, or the HPG axis. So essentially what happens, right, we're talking about a tropic cascade with the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus produces gonadotropin releasing hormone. The gonadotropin releasing hormone travels through the portal system to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then produces luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. The luteinizing hormone helps the gonads create the sex hormones. The follicle stimulating hormone helps the gonads produce the sex cells. And then, so that's what they do, right? So that LH and the FSH travels through the blood to the gonads, testes in males, ovaries in females. And we get the production of our sex cells and the production of our sex hormones. And these sex hormones then have a negative feedback onto the anterior pituitary to stop the production of LH and FSH, and onto the hypothalamus to prevent the hypothalamus from producing and releasing the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And so that's kind of our typical kind of process. Now, when we are children, there are some low levels of sex hormones in our body. Very minimal, but some kind of low baseline levels of the sex hormones. And even at that low level, the hypothalamus is super sensitive to the inhibition by these sex hormones. So even though we have very low levels of sex hormones in our body when we're children, the hypothalamus is still inhibited and not producing the releasing hormone. Now, as we get closer to puberty, the hypothalamus becomes less and less sensitive to that inhibition. And so those low levels of sex hormones that are circulating through our system start to have less and less of an effect on the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus starts to produce this gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it tends to produce the gonadotropin releasing hormone kind of in spurts, almost in like kind of waves. And that stimulates the anterior pituitary to make the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone, which then targets the testes and the ovaries to make more of these sex hormones. And we kind of cycle through this. We get more sex hormones, the hypothalamus becomes less sensitive. More gonadotropin releasing hormone, more luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone, more sex hormones, over and over and over and over, until we get the adult pattern. And we'll talk about what the adult patterns look like when we talk about reproductive physiology. So all of our reproductive systems, it does not matter which sex we are governed by this axis of hormones, this cascade involving the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the gonads.